8 criminals who mysteriously vanished. Criminals who are caught typically want to vanish, escaping the long arm of the law and living out their days in freedom, say fixing boats in some remote Mexican beach paradise, instead of behind bars where they belong. While the vast majority don't succeed, some don't even try. Occasionally, a clever criminal will somehow manage to simply disappear. These are just a few of the most well-known criminals who mysteriously vanished. Some of the names are notorious, Lord Lucan and so forth. Others remain safe in obscurity. The names on this list represent some of the most intriguing disappearances and cold cases ever. Who are notorious elusive criminals? Take a look and see for yourself what criminals have never been caught and managed to elude justice. 1. Joseph Snider. The narrow, brick chimney of a Louisiana bank became his tomb for 27 years, and now Joseph Snider will be laid to rest Sunday, in a proper grave with a proper farewell by his family. Still, his brother Robert wonders, how did he wind up in that chimney? Didn't anyone hear cries for help? Was it a robbery attempt gone awry, an accident or something more sinister? At least we know where he is now, Snider, 48, said, tears welling in his eyes ahead of his brother's weekend funeral and burial. At least he's home. Nearly 3 decades after he disappeared, much mystery lingers about the case of Joseph Snider, and a small-town bank in the southern Louisiana city of Abbeville. Police say Snider became trapped, and apparently died in the bank's chimney in 1984. But beyond that, they know little more. Everybody has an opinion, said Lieutenant David Hardy, Chief of Investigations for the Abbeville Police Department. But no one has evidence to say one way or another. If Joseph Snider did cry out for help, no one heard his pleas. The stench of death was never detected. The decades rolled on until last May when a construction worker helping turn the bank's vacant second floor into offices tugged some fabric out of the chimney and was showered with old clothes and human bones. Described as sweet-natured and relaxed by the few who remember him, Joseph Snider was 22 when his family last saw him in January 1984. He had no criminal record, but was wanted for possessing a stolen car. A lanky, rambling man, Snider was prone to wandering at an early age. In the years after they last saw them, his family, his mother, and 2 brothers and a sister, had not reported him missing, and no one searched for him. My mother worried about him, but I just said, "Mom, that's just Joseph being Joseph," Robert Snider said. He was always taking off for somewhere. Joseph first ran off around the age of 9 or 10, Robert recalled, adding his brother had dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. He worked now and then at this and that, quitting jobs when he became tired and moving on. He was briefly in the Louisiana National Guard, leaving with a medical discharge. One of the few pictures of him shows him in uniform, his dark eyes looking off into the distance. He was always going off somewhere, Robert Snider said. He told me he'd seen every state in the country. His brother won't guess why Joseph went into the chimney, but acknowledged in his final days in town that Joseph had gotten in with a bad crowd. He was carrying no burglary tools when found or anything to carry away money, if he had planned to rob the bank. Francis Placence, pastor of the church the Sniders attended, said he could see it as a misconceived burglary plan. He was the kind of guy who would do things, without really thinking them through, he said. After so many decades and so few clues, Abbeville police have declared the case closed. 2. Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin. In 1960, Frank Morris was a former foster child, who had committed his first crime at the age of 13, later graduating to possession of narcotics and armed robbery. He was believed to have been of superior intelligence, with an IQ of 133, when he was finally arrested and sent to Alcatraz. While there, he met John and Clarence Anglin, brothers arrested for a string of robberies in 1956, who were transferred to Alcatraz after a failed escape from another prison. While in Alcatraz, inmate Clarence Carnes, a participant in the infamous Alcatraz uprising 14 years earlier, befriended Morris and informed him of the access tunnel behind their cells, and Morris used the information to develop a means of escape. With inmate Alan West's help, Morris discovered ventilation shafts giving access to the roof and freedom. Morris and his collaborators studiously planned the escape for 8 months, using spoons to dig access into the corridor, leaving hair and plaster heads in their beds to cover their activities, cutting access to the roof with a stolen saw, fashioning a raft made of raincoats, and altering a concertina to act as a pump to inflate their raft. It is also believed that the trio was aided academically, with an issue of Sports Illustrated, which had been in the prison library, which had contained a section on low-cost ways to enjoy water sports. On June 11, 1962, they made their way up to the roof, down into the yard, over the perimeter fence and out onto the San Francisco Bay. There they pumped up their raft, put it in the water, jumped in and disappeared. It was quite possibly the most thoroughly researched and complex successful escape in criminal justice history. When the plaster heads were discovered in the morning, authorities had no way to tell how much of a head start they had. They were aided by a fourth man, Alan West, who helped them carve the tunnels, noting sea spray had weakened the cement compound through the years. Morris and the Anglins had originally intended to escape as a quartet with West, but they were forced to rethink their plans when it was discovered West's tunnel was too small for him to fit through. According to West, one of the Anglins argued that it was an all-or-none deal, but the other two said going back for West could foil the entire flight to freedom. The escape sparked the largest full-scale search at the time. Police found remains of the broken-up raft in San Francisco Bay, and one of their handmade oars at nearby Angel Island along with a personal packet from one of the men. Although the authorities never found any bodies, they were certain the men must have drowned, but sightings of the 3 men after the escape suggested that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had managed to escape. Indeed, someone claiming to be John Anglin called a local attorney before the escape became public. Clarence Carnes even received a postcard with the message "Gone Fishing," which he had been told he would get from the Anglin brothers, and Morris as a code word signaling their success. A paddle was also found on Angel Island leaning against a rock, providing evidence that the men may have survived. Alan West was moved to a lighter security prison, and granted an eventual reduction in sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the U.S. Marshals, detailing his participation in the escape plot. As the search went on, Harlem crime boss, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, claimed he had arranged a boat to pick up the men from the bay, whereupon Johnson claimed his boat then deposited the 3 men at Hunter's Point. However, Bumpy's claim had no credibility given his prior background of lying to gain favor, plan deals or to look important in the underworld. Nor can it be accurately pieced together what help Morris and the Anglins expected to get from Johnson, or vice versa. To date, the FBI believe all 3 men drowned in the bay. There were no crimes committed in the area after the escape unless they had truly been helped by Johnson. Given the circumstantial evidence surrounding their escape off the rock, no one is quite sure if they truly made it to shore. This case first aired on the February 8, 1989 episode, which devoted the entire episode to Alcatraz, including history of the failed escape attempts and the 1946 Alcatraz prisoner revolt before getting into the specifics on the 1962 escape. 2 theories were tested, one by having a triathlete swim from Alcatraz to the mainland and the other having 3 experienced kayakers paddle the same route in a replica of the makeshift raft used by the Anglins and Morris. While the rafters failed due to their raft being unseaworthy, and had to be rescued by a motorboat that was shadowing their progress, the swimmer succeeded at making it to shore. Unsolved mysteries speculated that the odds were likely the 3 fugitives survived. This case was also examined in the Discovery Channel series Mythbusters, and reinvestigated on America's Most Wanted. The Mythbusters proved it was certainly possible. They used the currents to reach the Marin Headlands instead of Angel Island, where the oar was found. AMW revealed reported sightings of Morris and the Anglin brothers after the escape. Other TV series have focused more on the ghosts of Alcatraz. The escape inspired the 1979 movie Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood as Frank Morris. The TV series America Declassified revealed a few more details, on this case not revealed in other programs, such as evidence of the raft on Angel Island, footprints leading away from the raft, and reports of a car stolen by 3 men after the escape. On October 12, 2015, interest in the case was renewed when History Channel premiered a documentary about the 1962 escape, focusing on John and Clarence Sanglin and the possibility that their escape was successful. Evidence produced by relatives including photos and Christmas cards seemed to suggest the Anglins might have escaped to Brazil. No evidence has been produced to disclose the whereabouts of Frank Morris. 3. Boston Corbett. Thomas H. Boston Corbett was born in London, England, in 1832. Along with his family, he came to New York in 1839. He eventually became a hatter in Troy. He married but his wife died in childbirth. Later he moved to Boston and continued working as a hatter there. Some have speculated that the use of mercury in the hatter's trade was a causative factor in Corbett's later mental problems. He became a reborn evangelical Christian while in Boston, from which he took a new name. He had been named Thomas when born in England. Reform became his purpose in life. Trying to imitate Jesus, he wore his hair very long. Acquaintances considered Corbett to be different. One vivid example of Corbett's eccentricity took place on July 16, 1858. Perhaps as a tribute to the loss of his late wife, or to avoid the temptation of prostitutes, Corbett took a pair of scissors and castrated himself. He then went to a prayer meeting and ate a full dinner. He took a walk. However, he eventually had to see a doctor. He ended up at the Massachusetts General Hospital and was treated by Dr. R.N. Hodges. The actual hospital record of Corbett's self-castration and treatment still exists. It can be read on p. 59 of the late Dr. John K. Latimer's book entitled Lincoln and Kennedy, Medical and Ballistic Comparisons of Their Assassinations. Corbett eagerly joined the Union Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. He re-enlisted 3 times, finally becoming a sergeant in the 16th New York Cavalry. On April 24, 1865, he was selected as one of the 26 cavalrymen from New York's 16th to pursue John Wilkes Booth. On April 26, Corbett and the others cornered Booth in a tobacco barn on the Virginia farm of Richard Garrett. David Harold gave up, and Detective Everton J. Conger set the barn on fire. Booth remained inside. As Booth moved about inside the burning barn, Corbett shot him with a Colt revolver from a distance of no more than 12 feet. He did this through a large crack in the barn. Corbett, a religious fanatic, explained his actions by saying, "Providence directed my hand." Booth's body was dragged from the barn, and he died a few hours later. His spinal cord had been punctured by Corbett's bullet. Corbett was placed under technical arrest, but the charges were dropped by Secretary of War Stanton. Stanton said, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives." Corbett received his share of the reward money, which amounted to $1,653.85. In his official statement of May 1, 1865, Corbett claimed he shot Booth because he thought Lincoln's assassin was getting ready to use his weapons. Afterwards Corbett returned to being a hatter, first in Boston at Samuel Mason's shop and later in Connecticut and New Jersey. Feeling threatened at a soldiers' reunion in Caldwell, Ohio, in 1875, he flashed his revolver in the faces of several men, who had alleged Booth was not really killed by Corbett. In 1878, Corbett moved to Concordia, Kansas. There Corbett lived in a dugout a few miles outside town. The site has been marked by a local Boy Scout troop. His home was stone-walled, and in a steep hill with a brownstone front and a roof made of brush, clay, and clapboards. Corbett's dugout is located southeast of Concordia. To visit the site, drive south on US 81 to the Cloud County Landfill Road, go 2 miles east, 3 miles south and 1/2 mile east. The monument is on the south side of the road in a pasture. The Cloud County Historical Museum has a great deal of information about Boston Corbett. In Concordia, Corbett slept on a homemade bed, and kept a variety of firearms. He purchased a flock of sheep. He won local respect for his ability to bring down crows and hawks. Sometimes he gave religious lectures which often turned into wild incoherencies. In 1887, Corbett was appointed assistant doorkeeper of the Kansas House of Representatives in Topeka. In the State House, on Tuesday, February 15, 1887, feeling paranoid after being threatened by several men in Topeka, Corbett pulled out his revolver, made some threats, and waved his weapon in the air. No one was hurt. Corbett was arrested, declared insane, and sent to the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. On May 26, 1888, Corbett jumped on a horse that had been left at the entrance to the asylum's grounds and escaped. He went to Neosho, Kansas, and stayed briefly with Richard Thatcher, a man he had met during his imprisonment at Andersonville during the Civil War. He said he was heading for Mexico. Although a few stories exist, there is no absolute proof that Boston Corbett was ever heard from again. He may have gone to Minnesota. His final demise, however, still remains a mystery. 4. Rocco Perri. Rocco Perri was called Canada's king of the bootleggers and Canada's Al Capone. He was also one of the most fascinating characters in the colorful history of North American organized crime. Perri was the head of the Calabrian mob in southern Ontario, and his right-hand person was his common-law wife, Bessie Starkman, the only Jewish woman in history to command an Italian mob. Rocco started out in the mob neighborhoods of Hamilton, Ontario, and created a booze empire that stretched in the United States. While other mobsters shipped booze south by boat along the coast, Rocco laundered his liquor as turnips, and sent boxcar loads south to New York and west to Chicago. He made deals with the pillars of the Canadian establishment. Selling liquor to the United States from Canada was perfectly legal here, but it took Rocco and Bessie Perri to send it on its way. Strangely, although it was legal to manufacture and export the stuff, it was illegal to sell it in Ontario, so Rocco doubled his profits by re-importing some of it back into Ontario. In the late 1920s, Rocco and Bessie moved into the narcotics racket, and used their connections in New York, New Jersey and Philadelphia to sell the drugs. But Bessie was growing arrogant, and one night in 1930, she was ambushed by two hitmen in the garage of their Hamilton home and killed with 2 shotgun blasts. Rocco kept up the rackets, and in the mid-1930s, he was on top of the game again with a strong Jewish woman by his side, Annie Newman. With prohibition over in the United States, but government-controlled liquor stores in Ontario, Rocco used his old Chicago connections to create a prohibition-in-reverse racket, smuggling booze into Canada from the Windy City. And throughout his career, Rocco was dogged and tracked by the RCMP's operative No. 1 Frank Zenith. Zenith finally got Rocco, at the beginning of the Second World War, under the War Measures Act. Rocco disappeared soon after he was released at the end of the war, and it is believed that he's in a barrel of cement at the bottom of Hamilton Bay. 5. Sylvester Matuska. "I like to see people die," Sylvester Matuska said at his trial. "I like to hear them scream." For a 2-year period during the early 1930s, Matuska did his best to make that happen, eventually killing 22 people and listening to the screams of hundreds in Hungary and Austria. He just picked a strange way to do it. He engineered train wrecks. The Serbia-born Matuska is credited with engineering 4 such wrecks, though there may have been others. After his capture, he revealed that he enjoyed witnessing the crashes, and sometimes experienced a sexual release as the metal tore, and fire burst from the engines, throwing screaming passengers from the wreckage. But questions remain even today about his motivations. Were they political or sexual or something else altogether? Was Matuska a revolutionary or a madman? Matuska was fascinated by the train wrecks he engineered to the point he was sexually aroused by witnessing them. But anti-Nazi graffiti left at least one of his crash sites, as well as his later rumored involvement with Russian and Chinese military efforts indicate Matuska also carried an interest in communism, and possibly a commitment to the cause. He claimed after his arrest in Hungary that he arranged the crashes at God's bidding, a statement that further complicates his suspected motives. We may never fully know why Matuska derailed trains. A decade after the train derailments, Matuska escaped from a Hungarian prison during World War II and disappeared. There are rumors about what happened next, where he went, what he did, and what his ultimate fate was, but the story of his later life is clouded with rumors and unsubstantiated reports. Sylvester Matuska was born on January 29, 1892, at Ksantaver, now Kantavir, an ethnic Hungarian village in an agricultural region in northern Serbia. Little is known of his formative years except that he trained as a mechanical engineer at some point, and that he may have served as an officer in the Austro-Hungary army during World War I as an explosives specialist. He would have been 21 years old when the war broke out in 1914. After the war he worked in mining, and may have owned his own mine. He began following his true calling, derailing railroad trains, in December 1930 and again in January 1931. When he tried unsuccessfully to engineer two wrecks in Austria. There may have been other unsuccessful attempts, but he first succeeded on August 8, 1931 when the explosives he planted on the tracks of Berlin-Basel Express south of Berlin was able to knock the train off the tracks, and cause a large number of injuries. Unfortunately, from Matuska's point of view, there were no fatalities. By this time, Germany's National Socialist Nazi Party, headed by Adolf Hitler in 1925, had become the second largest political party in Germany, and was gaining strength almost daily. The Nazis' primary enemy at that time were communists. Investigators at the site of the Berlin-Basel crash found a Nazi newspaper that had been defaced and began speculating that the derailment was a political act, quickly blamed on communists. Anonymous letters sent to authorities praising the revolution led them to connect the attempted derailments to political motives. A reward of 100,000 Reichsmarks, the equivalent to about $150,000 US dollars in 2016, was announced for information leading to the arrest of whoever was responsible for attempting to crash the express. Then in September, Matuska struck again, this time with even greater success. He blew up a portion of the Bajatoa-Erbiji bridge near Budapest, Hungary at 12:20 a.m. on September 13, 1931 and succeeded in derailing the Vienna Express as it crossed the bridge. The train's engine and 9 of its 11 cars plunged off the structure and down 98 feet, 30 meters, into a ravine, killing 22 people outright and injuring 120 others, 17 of them seriously. Matuska, who was found lurking in the area. But in the confusion that followed the crash, Matuska was able to pass himself off as a surviving passenger from the train and disappear. The track over Bajatoa-Erbiji bridge has since been abandoned, but in 1982 it was reused in a recreation of the 1931 train wreck for the West German and Hungarian motion picture The Train Killer, based on Matuska. Still under the impression the crashes were politically motivated, Hungarian Prime Minister Gyula Karolyi declared martial law, and executed 2 representatives of the banned Hungarian Communist Party. By this time, however, authorities from at least 2 European countries were closing in on Matuska, and he was arrested on October 10, 1931 in Vienna, Austria. At least one source reports that he was arrested after he tried to collect compensation from Hungarian railways, claiming that he was a passenger on the Vienna Express, and had been injured in the crash. After his arrest, Matuska readily confessed to his crimes, and at his trial the search for motive began to veer away from the political. During the trial he commented on liking to see people die, and further claimed that God had ordered him to cause the crashes. Matuska also mentioned an imaginary accomplice, and was quite open about the sexual component of his actions. In all, his sanity was clearly called into question. He was nonetheless tried and convicted in Austria for his unsuccessful December and January attempts and then extradited to Hungary, on condition that he not be executed. Austria has a long history of opposition to capital punishment, having first outlawed the practice, though it was later reinstituted, as early as 1787. In his Hungarian trial he was found guilty of murder in connection with the Vienna Express crash, and sentenced to death. But because of the agreement between Hungary and Austria, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Matuska was imprisoned in northern Hungary at Vak, but disappeared from there in 1944 as World War II raged in Europe and Russian forces pushed west into Germany and German-occupied territory. What happened to him after that is open to speculation. The Russian army may have used him as an explosives expert in the remaining months of the war, as some investigators have claimed. Unsupported rumors circulated that he was later involved in work with the Chinese Communists during the Korean War. In other reports he returned to Hungary under a false name in the 1970s, and he may have been part of a right-wing Hungary officers association that arranged his escape from the Vak prison. Some people also claim he was a long-serving Russian agent that had been planted in Hungary years earlier. Any of these possibilities, if true, have never been definitely determined. Matuska was never recaptured. His fate remains as unclear as the motives behind his actions. Despite his possible political connections, and the apparent mental illness of his later statements, modern researchers have also suggested Matuska suffered from symphorophilia, a condition that involves arousal when staging and watching disasters. The term was created by psychologist and author John William Money, who wrote that the illness may be more widespread than initially assumed. For those members of the general public who have a touch of sadomasochism in them, Money wrote, disaster as an unrehearsed event is often a large part of the appeal of entertainment stunts and sports, from the circus to stock car racing. Matuska may have had more than a touch of sadomasochism in him and could have suffered from symphorophilia. Modern psychologists could diagnose Matuska with having mental illness. His reported involvement with communist causes in Europe and Asia added to his folklore. Many people still suggest he was making a political statement, with his train derailments in addition to getting a sexual thrill out of the resulting mayhem. But in the end, as one researcher wrote, no one will ever know if Sylvester Matuska started out a political extremist and developed a taste for the chaos and destruction, or, as appears to be the case, was a complete madman. In truth, he was probably all those things. 6. Lucky Lord Lucan. Nearly 42 years after the discovery of his blood-splattered car on the Sussex coast sparked a mystery that became an enduring national obsession. Lord Lucan has been declared dead after a High Court judge granted his death certificate. The ruling by Mrs. Justice Asplin, after a hearing lasting barely 60 minutes, allowed the son of the mustachioed peer, who disappeared following the murder of his children's nanny, to inherit his father's title as the 8th Earl Lucan. But any hope that the formal declaration under the newly introduced Presumption of Death Act might draw a line once and for all under the question of what happened at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, the Lucan family home in central London, on November 7, 1974, and thereafter appeared forlorn. The new Earl, George Bingham, 49, who had applied for the death certificate to be issued, insisted after the hearing in central London that the case continues to be a mystery and his father remains innocent. He was speaking shortly after Neil Berryman, the son of Sandra Rivet, the nanny who Scotland Yard believed at the time had been bludgeoned to death by Lord Lucky Lucan, after mistaking her for his estranged wife Veronica, emerged from the court to say he believed he had new evidence to suggest the aristocrat was alive as recently as 2002. Mr. Berryman, who had been adopted prior to his mother's killing, and only learned her identity 8 years ago, following the death of his adoptive mother, declared that he had in recent weeks seen an internal Scotland Yard document indicating that the peer lived long after his supposed suicide in 1974. The 48-year-old builder claimed the initial investigations into his mother's death had been tainted by police corruption, adding, This is closure and a time to move on for George Bingham and his family. I can understand that he wants to move on with his life, but for me this is something at this moment that cannot happen." He added, "Maybe the police know more than they let on. But at the end we have to get to the truth and justice for Sandra. A horrible death, a young woman beaten, my mother. There is no getting away from the fact that whatever happened that night, Lord Lucan is guilty of something in my eyes." Ems Rivet, 28, had gone down into the basement of the Belgravia house to make a cup of tea when her killer attacked her with a length of lead piping wrapped in a bandage and placed her body in a canvas mail sack. When Lady Lucan, who was estranged from her husband, went to investigate, she too was attacked but managed to escape, running while covered in blood to a nearby pub. Lady Lucan named her husband as the attacker, and an inquest declared him the murderer of Ems Rivet a year later. The whereabouts of the 7th Earl, a professional gambler and a fixture in London's lounge netherworld of clubs and moneyed aristocrats, has been a subject of high speculation and low drama ever since the night of the killing. After driving to New Haven in a Ford Corsair, stopping off to speak with a friend and write 2 letters, Lucan disappeared. Some, including his son, believe that the peer died that night, probably taking his own life by drinking heavily and sinking a borrowed boat. Among the more outlandish versions of his suggested suicide was an account that Lucan shot himself at the Kent Zoo owned by his high-rolling friend John Aspinall, and asked that his remains be fed to one of its resident tigers. But the alternative theory that Lucan used powerful connections to escape abroad to a life in luxurious but anonymous exile has lingered potently with sightings in the intervening years, from Australia to Ireland and Mozambique to Paraguay. His rediscovery in Goa in 1996 caused a flurry of excitement until it was discovered that the man in question was not Lucan, but a lifelong hippie known as Jungly Berry. Although the 7th Earl had been previously declared legally dead in 1999, his son argued that the declaration had not proved death for all purposes, including his right to accede to his father's title. Mr. Bingham, a former merchant banker, who was married last month to a Danish heiress, confirmed he would be taking up his earldom immediately, and underlined that the death of his former nanny, whom he described as a lovely lady, remained unexplained. He said, "It is still a mystery what happened. We do not know how this lovely lady died in 1974, but Neil lost a mother and I lost a father. We still do not know how he met his end. And as a British person, I still prefer to consider a person innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Nonetheless, I am very pleased with the result that we achieved today." The new Earl and Mr. Berriman shook hands in court, and Ems Rivet's son said she wished Mr. Bingham good luck, before adding that he nonetheless considered his new title a bit tainted. During the hearing, Mr. Berriman had been asked to produce the Metropolitan Police document, to which he had referred. He declined, saying it was not yet possible, before adding outside court that he hoped his own inquiries would end the Lucan mystery in 12-14 months' time. The Yard said that, like all unsolved murders, the killing of Ems Rivet remained an open case. 7. Aribert Heim. Nazi war criminal and Austrian Dr. Aribert Heim was known as Dr. Death, because of his horrific medical experiments on Jews at the Mauthausen concentration camp during World War II. He was captured by U.S. soldiers in 1945, but later released. Heim returned to work as a gynecologist for many years. One day in 1962, after learning the police were waiting for him at his home, he vanished. What happened after that remains somewhat of a mystery. Many believe that Heim lived in Egypt under an assumed name, Tarek Farid Hussein. The New York Times reported that he died of cancer in Cairo back in 1992. Because of a lack of evidence, however, German police are still actively investigating Heim's whereabouts. Few of the Nazi war criminals who escaped prosecution after the war were the subject of so many rumors, stories and speculation as Aribert Heim. For decades, the former concentration camp doctor, who was called Dr. Death, and the butcher of Mauthausen for his brutality, had been one of the most sought-after Nazis. The question of whether Heim was still alive kept police, judges, Nazi hunters and the media occupied for decades. 3 years ago, the first evidence of Heim's death emerged. Now that version of events has become official. On Friday, a district court in the German town of Baden-Baden declared Heim to be dead, and ended legal proceedings against the suspected war criminal. The judges concluded that Heim died of cancer in Egypt in 1992. Heim had topped the list of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's most wanted Nazi war criminals. During World War II, Heim is believed to have murdered more than 300 people in a grisly manner, at the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Among other things, he had been charged with injecting gasoline into patients' bodies near their hearts, and operating on people without anesthesia. After the war, Heim remained in Germany, working as a doctor at a gynecological practice in Baden-Baden until 1962, when he went into hiding. In 1979, the public prosecutor's office in Baden-Baden pressed charges against Heim, and issued an international arrest warrant. In 2007, German investigators intensified their search for Heim, monitoring family and friends of the war criminal more closely in Austria and Spain. Together, private individuals and public institutions had offered a six-figure bounty on information leading to Heim's capture. Suspect lived for decades in Egypt. The jury court said Friday it believed that Heim left Germany in 1963 using his second name Ferdinand, and that he traveled to Egypt on a tourist visa. He then lived in hiding in Cairo for decades using the name. In 1980, he apparently converted to Islam and then assumed the name Tarek Hussein Farid. They believe he died at the age of 78 on August 10, 1992 in Cairo. Both the New York Times and German broadcaster ZDF reported in 2009 about Heim's purported death. A few days later, a middleman provided state police investigators with documents relating to Heim's alleged death. And earlier this year, Spiegel reported that the case was close to getting resolved. After initial doubts, criminal investigators in the state of Baden-Württemberg now believe the documents are authentic. In addition, Heim's defense attorney also presented investigators with further documents including a certificate indicating he had converted to the Muslim faith. The court also heard testimony from Heim's son, who officials said had given credible statements. The judges on Friday said they have no doubt that Heim and Tarek Hussein Farid are the same person, and that he died of cancer-related complications in 1992. 8. Hinrich Mueller. It was one of the great remaining mysteries surrounding the final days of World War II, what happened to Hinrich Mueller, the head of the Gestapo secret police, and the highest-ranking Nazi never to have been captured or located. But a leading German researcher said Thursday, he has uncovered historical documents indicating Mueller never made it, more than a few hundred meters, yards, from Hitler's bunker in downtown Berlin, and was eventually buried in a common grave in a Jewish cemetery destroyed by the Nazis. Though Mueller's body hasn't been found, Johannes Tuchel, the director of Berlin's German Resistance Memorial Center, said the evidence he uncovered is clear-cut. He said that, according to a death certificate he found, Mueller died in the final days of the war, in 1945 near the Luftwaffe headquarters. Tuchel said other evidence shows that about 3 months after the end of the war Mueller's body was found by a work crew cleaning up corpses, and buried along with about 3,000 others in a communal grave on the site of a Jewish cemetery that the SS had destroyed in 1943. The documents show with near certainty that Mueller was buried in August 1945, in the garden of the Luftwaffe headquarters, then brought to the Jewish cemetery on Grosshamburger Strasse, said Tuchel, whose story was first reported by Bild newspaper. Mueller, who was an SS Gruppenführer, roughly equivalent to a major general, was sought for decades after the war by investigators around the world, including Israel's Mossad, the U.S. Office of Special Investigations, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Tuchel said he had no explanation for why they hadn't come up with the same information. That is a part of the puzzle I can't answer, he said. The Simon Wiesenthal Center's top Nazi hunter, Ephraim Zurov, sounded a note of caution, saying only DNA evidence could prove Mueller was buried in Berlin. The Nazis who wanted to escape very often took measures to create false documents faking their death, he said in a telephone interview from London. I would be very wary of reports like that without forensic evidence. He cited the case of Aribert Heim, a Mauthausen concentration camp doctor who allegedly died in Cairo in 1992. Heim was buried, according to his son, in a mass grave for poor people in Cairo, and it's a perfect story because it's impossible to verify, Zurov said. It's not yet known whether any efforts will be made to find Mueller's bones in Berlin. According to the Berlin Jewish community's website, the cemetery included the grave of philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, and was destroyed by the SS in 1943, when they built trenches through the area. At war's end, it was used to bury bombing victims, and other war casualties that littered the German capital. Tuchel came across the documents when researching an incident, in which Mueller ordered the execution of 18 resistance members at the end of the war. In addition to a December 1945 death certificate for Mueller, Tuchel said he has evidence that the identity papers and medals were later turned over to military authorities to return to his family. And in 1963, when authorities were looking into a rumor that Mueller had been buried in West Berlin's Neukölln district, a gravedigger told police in testimony Tuchel found that he had buried Mueller in the former Jewish cemetery, and had matched his identity papers to the face of the body. Tuchel said the man did not give any indication as to Mueller's cause of death. According to an article in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies journal in 2001, the gravedigger's story was known but could never be checked out because the graves were on the other side of the Berlin Wall. Though there were persistent alleged sightings of Mueller in the decades after the war, including in Czechoslovakia, Cuba and Argentina, experts have always maintained that he most likely died in Berlin at the war's end. That was the fate of Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann, who was thought to have escaped the capital, until his bones were unearthed during construction in 1972, in downtown Berlin. DNA tests in 1998 confirmed they were his. Zurov said that, if the information on Mueller does turn out to be true, it would be a comforting thought that Mueller, who attended the notorious 1942 Wannsee Conference, in which plans were coordinated for the genocide of the European Jews, didn't escape. This is the biggest fish that got away, Zurov said. Still, if his final resting place is a Jewish cemetery, Zurov said it would be absolutely horrifying. It's the last place on earth where he should be buried, said Zurov. If this is ever verified, they'd better move very quickly to make sure it doesn't become a shrine for neo-Nazis.